every single teacher I met, who I accepted as a teacher, I couldn't help but treat them as if they were Lord Buddha. Some might agree with that, some might not. But for me, that made sense. Because I didn't know. And I went to them because I thought they knew. And many of them did know a lot of things. And they were generous to share so much with me over the years. Many of them have died. Some of them, when I met them, I knew they were not going to live for a long time. So I had to really make the most of the time that I had with them. Especially because they were accepting me to be around them, annoy them with questions. And boy, did I annoy them. But with respect, of course. I say this because we're living in a time period where the lines are getting blurred between roles. People are not holding valuable those relationships that have withstood the test of time for eons. So it's a good thing to have that relationship with someone you consider to be your teacher, and treat them with due respect. That also interruption is something that I would see often. Interrupting someone when they speak, especially if it is a teacher, it's quite disrespectful. Now the mind, your mind, the person's mind, when they are going at 100,000 miles a second, they're not listening. There's no way that the teacher will find a way to squeeze in a word of wisdom, even edgewise, in all that traffic that's going on in the mind of the student. So I keep saying, empty the bucket, empty the bowl, empty your bowl, empty your cup. A wise teacher will tell you several things. The top of the list will have to be urgency. But the very close second would be to teach you, to learn, to empty the junk in your head. You probably have heard about that story. I think it was in ancient Japan, where someone who was very erudite, knowledgeable, I guess, a counselor to the court, to the emperor or the shogun, very top, educated person in that time period and in that part of the world. So he had studied and learned all that could be learned, but somehow he heard about this old wise man, a teacher, living in the mountains. And he said, well, I can't consider myself to be a teacher unless I've studied under him. Imagine what that will look like on my CV. So he goes. He has the connections, the means. So he ends up reaching the place up in the mountains. And he goes into the kuti, the small hut of this old man, who's considered to be the wisest man in Japan at the time. And he sits there with all his stuff. And as it's custom, he's a guest, he introduces himself. And the master says, please sit down. And he starts making tea. And he puts a cup in front of him and a cup in front of himself. And the master, out of courtesy, starts pouring tea for the guest first. And he pours, pours, pours. It's a small capacity cup. Obviously it's overflowing, and the man sees this. He's embarrassed. Maybe the old man is blind, senile. Perhaps, did I make a mistake? This is embarrassing. Finally, he puts his hand and he says, enough, enough, enough. He stops the pouring of the tea. And the old man pulls his hand back in the kettle, and he smiles and looks at his eyes and he says, you've come here with a full cup. How can I fill it? It's already full. Every time you go into an interview, every time you ask a question of anyone, not the teacher, anyone, empty your cup. Learn to listen. Learn to listen. And this is not just in the case of spiritual context or mental development, cultivation context. This is something that families do all the time, and we learn these habits, these negative habits, from our families, our surroundings. It's understandable. Our societies, especially now, it's the most toxic society ever that human beings have produced on a massive scale, collectively. So one of the hardest things that I would discover in helping family members communicate was to get people to quiet down, literally to shut their mouth. And in America, it's like, oh, you can't say shut up to someone. Oh, I would say that all the time to my even high school students. Parents would complain this and that. My students loved me because they knew what was behind those words. They knew I was trying so hard, day and night, to teach them something. They knew I cared as a person. But I had to teach these family members to learn how to care for each other. And you cannot show to someone that you care for them unless you close your mouth for a little while they're talking. Now the problem is, most people, when they are quiet, they're actually pulling the bowstring. They're getting ready to let go. They're not listening. They're pulling the trigger, just getting ready, cocking it, just getting ready and about to just shoot. Because they're not listening. They're preparing for an attack. And this is something I've seen again and again and again when students come trying to tell me their life story, or trying to tell me in very, very indirect, nice, maybe even respectful ways that they know better their situation. Well, how can I actually help? Why are you even there? How can this other human being, who's not you, really help you if you really feel in your bones that he doesn't know you or she doesn't know you? Why are you even sitting there in an uncomfortable position on the ground? Seriously? Don't we have better things to do? So I would see this in couples, in family members. And one of the techniques that I would always encourage them to do is the listening technique. I would get a timer, 1 minute, just 1 minute. And I would put it in plain sight. Both of them, if it's a couple, or the family member could learn to watch. 1 minute. They pick who it will be, the person who will start speaking. 1 minute. The clock is ticking. And the person starts to talk, speak about anything that they like to speak about. Now, the trick is the other person, when the time is up, they will stop. Whoever was speaking, they will stop speaking. And now it's the other person's turn, but not the way they think it is. What that means is, they will now have to repeat exactly what the other person said. Interesting. And it would be so funny just sitting there and seeing, well, this is in case they don't interrupt, and it's rare that they don't interrupt during that 1 minute as the other person's speaking. And they would jump in. It's like, no, you're wrong. No. 1 minute is theirs, not yours. Okay. And they would jump in again. Again, I had to stop them. And I would restart the clock. And they know it's their valuable time that's going by. So, okay. And now they're preparing for an attack, though, in their quiet time. And then they start to speak and they say, well, the thing you just said is incorrect because that, and I, no. You have to repeat exactly what the meaning of it, the gist of it. For 1 minute they said a lot of things, but you have to convey to them, I heard you say this, and you list. You said this, and then you said this. You're not presenting your opinion or your rebuttal at all. Because there's always someone smarter than you in the room, always. Especially someone who lived with you. They would know some things, a few things. So eventually the parents, the family members, the couple will learn to finally, like, oh, there's another person who has a brain, who has a heart, who has feelings. They have some things to say, apparently. I didn't know that. I thought it was just me who has something important to say. We never think like that, but we feel that way completely. And that's why we want to interrupt constantly. Because we're subsumed, we're enveloped in our own feelings, as if they're the only ones that matter. And that's the situation in the world today. It's on a massive scale. That's what we're seeing. So families, that's one of the reasons why families don't get along anymore as they used to even. They used to have some level of tolerance. Now it's getting less and less. And you cannot blame just the kids anymore or the grandkids. It's the whole thing. In Armenian there's a saying, the rotten fish smells from the head down. The head down. So if it's gotten rotten, it's check the head first. That goes bad first. Who's the head of the family? The adults. Because the kids learn. I've seen this again and again, decade after decade, working with children, elementary teacher, and then a high school teacher. In college, I used to see that. And then as a therapist as well. So we carry those habits into our sitting, into our practice. We believe our thoughts so much. We believe our internal monologue. It's a monologue because there's only you. It's ricocheting back and forth. If it's a dialogue, at least there's two people. Unless you have schizophrenia or something. But I don't think any of you has those symptoms. So listening is an art because it's beautiful when you open up and you actually hear another human being speak, even though they might not say things that you agree with. But something magical happens when you say to them, repeat to them, this is what I heard you say. And then, by the way, at the end of that, this is what I heard you say, and then this, and then you're watching an interesting, magical phenomenon that is taking place in front of you. Suddenly, the person who is now hearing their partner or family member repeat to them what they had said, their facial muscles relax. They start breathing suddenly. They're not holding themselves like, okay, in the defensive, oh my God, he's about to come, she's about to come on the, on the attack. Instead, they start opening up. They're speaking and I'm opening up. That's very unusual. That's what you see in front of your eyes. It's wonderful. And then, if they get all the points right, sometimes they don't, and the other person says, no, that's not what I said, and now they have to stop. What did you mean then? The person now can add one sentence or two to clarify, and then we stop them, and then this person says, okay, and the third point was that you are saying this, this, this. Is this correct? Finally, when all the points are right, the person says, yeah, that's what I was saying. Now it's their turn. 1 minute. And then they could say, they could do the rebuttal, they could do just talking about other stuff, And now the other person has to listen 1 full minute. It's a beautiful, it's a game of human relationships. And it unfolds in front of your eyes. It's wonderful. Because now, for the first time, they see each other. Because when you stand in front of the mirror, you're not seeing each other, actually. It's what you would like to see. And when you go to an interview, that's what you would like to present. And when the other person, whether it's a teacher or a fellow meditator or a total stranger, they're seeing you with much clearer eyes than you, because you have very foggy vision. Nobody's been wiping the glasses, the windows. There's a lot of cataract there. You have to clean it up. So that requires humility. But the person has to want to do that. It cannot be forced. One of the things that happens when a person goes into a monastery, you have to be disciplined. And that's why monks, traditionally, you have to start as a novice. In fact, later on they came up with the Anagarika tradition, which is not a bad idea. Before you take on a large amount of rules on your shoulders, you can have about 8 or 10, that's fine. And you can still function without those restrictions. And you can test it to see if this is the right thing for me. And after you've done that for 6 months to a year, then the abbot or the senior monk who's responsible, they would go ahead and ordain you as a samanera or samaneri. But a lot is happening because you're confronting certain uncomfortable situations. Cleaning this up. No one is supposed to abuse anyone, by the way. The abuse is not acceptable at all. But just, there's a lot of mirrors around you. Each of those human beings you're associated with, including the dogs that you might see running around, if there are some, they're your mirrors. The way you treat the path, the walkway, the way you prepare the altar, the way you organize your teacher's table, let's say. It's disciplining you. Years ago, when I was learning how to practice Kyudo, which is Japanese art of archery, it's very highly influenced by both Shinto and Zen Buddhism. I was so eager because I had a fondness for the bow and arrow. Especially Kyudo archery, it's like the bow is much taller than you, and I'm tall, so it's taller than my height. So I couldn't believe when I got my hands on a bow that my teacher, my sensei, handed me. But before he did so, I found myself every week learning how to walk. And he was very methodical, he was very meticulous. He was very insistent that I walk a certain way, and I hated it because I was seeing other students come and within 3-4 weeks he would be handed a bow, and I'm like, excuse me. I didn't say excuse me, but I said, okay, there's a reason. There's a reason why my sensei is not giving me the bow. So it ended up being 6 months. So I went to see him in private, and he smiled. And he said, you're almost there. But, and then about, a month or so later, he handed me a bow and an arrow. Okay, so I'm thinking I'm going to start shooting the bow. And by the way, the target it's makiwara. It's like made from tatami, which is straw mats that are useless. So they dip it in water for a long time, so it becomes very, it's malleable. You can do things with it. So they tighten it for a long time. patiently, until it becomes so tight. So it becomes this round thing that it's almost like a wall. It's impenetrable, but it's just straw, right? So it's so tight that, and it's about this far away from you, about a foot away from the tip of the bow when you extend the bow out like this. The tip of the bow. And you do it diagonally. So we had to learn the kata, the walk to and how we enter the zendo in a sense, and how I had to walk and maneuver. Still the walking was extremely crucial because he would come in and fix it, despite the fact that I had spent more than half a year. But I was not allowed to put the bow in its place and pull. I'm so grateful for my sensei. He taught me so much because it took me about 3 years to shoot my first arrow. Discipline. There were people who came in within a month and a half, they were shooting. And they had just started. Actually, they started later than I. And I would see them, and I would see the teacher's attention on them. Maybe he would try a few times, and then he would just pull away because the person would not be listening. And you can tell how developed is the mind of this person, because ultimately the target is not the makiwara, it's the mind. It's the mind that you're targeting. It's a Zen philosophy. It's beautiful. But you can tell how the mind is of the person as they release. In fact, they are not the ones to release the bow, the arrow. The arrow decides when to release itself. And it's a very, very heavy pull, because you have the special kind of glove and you're holding it like this. There's a notch here. And it gets and as men, we will use muscle to hold it. As women, my teacher would say how easy it is to teach them, because they would use very little muscle. And it's all about allowing and being flexible and open. As the bow and the arrow do their thing and the arrow is released, it just goes like butter. But then you hear the sloppiness, the bowstring, all that, the bow turns around. Sometimes the bow flies from the person's hand as they're releasing it. Big bow. So why do I say this? There is an art of allowing that needs to be done by the person. It's beautiful if we allow it. The Dhamma has nothing to do with your ideas, okay? Nothing to do with your ideas, with your concepts, with your projections, with what you think the Dhamma is or should be. All the stuff that you've gathered, put them nicely in a package, send them out into the ocean. Don't even put them in a glass jar, because somebody else might pick it up and worship it. Let it dissolve and go back, be recycled somehow, because if it was useful, it must have already done its job in getting you somewhere. The Dhamma is all about practice. It's all about experiencing it. What is it? The Dhamma. The Dhamma is the only thing that can know itself. You have to get yourself out of the equation completely. And when you're doing an interview with your teacher, that's what the teacher is trying, hopefully, to do. So you putting yourself in there is messing up the whole equation. Okay? Has nothing to do with it. So I would like to have, I share those thoughts with you. And also, on a slightly mundane level, please keep the questions just keep them as questions. Primarily, the teacher has to ask you questions. Your job is to answer. But it's also an opportunity for the student, if they have questions, genuine questions, to ask, of course. That's why you have an interview. But you don't have to tell me your whole life story. You don't. I don't know how I've been able to survive, but I just finished the translating the sutta for tonight. I haven't rested. I didn't even take a 5-second nap. Now, I'm not saying this to make you feel bad. What I'm saying is, it's not supposed to be. This many people should not be taking me over 3 hours. It took me today over 3 hours and 20 some minutes. 25. 3 hours and 25 minutes. And I try my best to be there for each and every one of you. But I need you guys to be considerate. So let's do this. Some of you are very considerate. Beautiful. You can see as you're sitting, you're like, okay, I don't want to take more time. I don't want to, okay, Bhante, yes. And okay, and you have questions? Yes, I have that question. Done, and they're out. So let's keep it short, please. 5 minutes is more than sufficient time for me to ask questions, to provide you with some guidance, and for you to ask me questions, and for me to give you some elaborations. So, don't squeeze the life out of your teacher. I still have a life, you know. I don't know how I've been able to do every week a sutta class. I don't know how, but remember, yes, I keep saying it to you. I keep saying it to myself. Dhammo have rakkati dhammachari. He who protects the Dhamma, he who lives by the Dhamma protects and takes care of you. Yeah, but let's not push it, please. So I appreciate your understanding. I'm glad that I think there's only one question in the jar. I believe. Oh, it's double. Oh. Okay. Yes. Today's sutta is truly a special one because it's an unusual sutta. Because when I first came across it, I was like, am I reading this wrong? Because it gives you such, you can see the tenderness of Lord Buddha, even more so, abundantly, clearly. And while he's teaching you what is often considered to be the most complex principle in the whole entire Dhamma, the elaborate Paticca Samuppada. How? We'll find out. It is the Upanisa Sutta. Upanisa. And in case you're wondering, does it have any relationship with Upanishad? Yeah. The name. Remember a few weeks ago, I think it was last week, I was talking about Upanishad and what the word is meant. I remember, I think it was the first week I had met my teacher, Bhante Ratanasara. He was already very old. And he was my first teacher of Pali years ago. And he was the one who actually encouraged me, and I just fell in love with Pali because of him, the way he would suddenly go off. I would ask him questions, he would go, ah. Bhante Punnaji had also that kind of tonality. It's like, you know, ah. So he would suddenly start reciting verses upon verses. And there was some musicality to them. And I was curious what these words meant. And I still remember he pointed out the word Upanishad, where does it come from? And he broke it down to upa. He says upa is close, close. Nisa comes from nishidati or nisidati in Pali. We don't have shi in this case. Nishida, in Pali, it's nisidati. And he looked down. I was sitting right there. There was this big table, and his cat, his name was Bobby Joe. He had black and white spots. And he would go, and my teacher pointed down and he said, upa nishidati. So that's the image I got when I just, see this word, Upanishad or Upanisa. But it's not just sitting close. Well, the sitting close had a purpose, because in those days, it was just about reciting it to your student. And the student had to be singular, by the way. You weren't teaching it to multitudes of students. You were teaching it to those select few. And usually that meant the student had to live with the teacher. You all know about Angulimala. But before he became Angulimala, he was Ahinsaka. Well, he was a very bright student. He was so top-notch, like straight A student in his world, that he had to live with his teacher in his house. So the teacher could guide him. And you have the same thing in other educational modalities. Like I know, for example, in case of Chinese martial arts, when a person is going to teach and they finally accepted you, you will have to go and live with them. The same thing in Japan. If somebody had to, let's say, learn from Morihei Ueshiba, the one who founder of Aikido, you had to go and pretty much live with him. It's not just martial arts. So that close living will teach you who the teacher is, and will show the teacher who the person is. Because you might be showing the teacher an image that is not reality. Remember I said a few times this week, check the Vimansaka Sutta. Lord Buddha says again and again, don't just judge from appearances. If you look at a monk, a bhikkhu, a teacher, and you say, look at him. He's never shaken by all the money or this and that, or he doesn't look like he can actually be bought. He says, he might have that look, but don't be so quick to judge. Either a yes or a no. Let him get the opportunity first to have those supporters, to have all that money coming in, and then see, that position. And then you see if this person is really worth his weight in gold, as you claim. So the same thing. Close proximity living is essential to know. For example, you might be in a relationship with someone, but you never live with them. You just see them on, weekends and things, like this is when you're getting to know them, or just friends, acquaintances, until you go out on a trip with them, a vacation, and you have to share the room with them, or 2 rooms or something. And then all of a sudden, the travel plans seem to be like, and you want to kill the person. And they want to kill you, probably, or run away from you. You don't agree with the food, the choices of activities, all these things. What happened? You knew each other for 24 years. What happened? Well, you never lived with each other. You never felt each other's company that much in such a manner. But this is not about close living. I'm just giving you, when I explain that, I'm sure you have figured it out by now, I like to give a 360 view of something. I'm never just like, yeah, it's that, go home. I never liked that. I never enjoyed that. I like to know the nuances I like to understand the contextual presence of a phenomenon, of an event, so I can really appreciate it. And that's how I also translate suttas. It's not dry. I don't like that. It has depth. I need to know the person's story. What happened there? So here, Upanisa has all these nuances attached to it. But why? Because it's showing us the association between the links of causal relations, dependent arising, paticca samuppada. One of the worst things we could do in understanding or exploring paticca samuppada is looking at it in a linear fashion, which is exactly what every single scholar pretty much has done. Almost everyone. And that's how the Western mind has picked it up. I no longer can say actually Western mind, because pretty much it's everywhere. That linear thinking. Yesterday I was talking about the left brain, or the other day. The left brain can only understand the parts, and beautifully, all the dimensions of each of the parts, but it will never understand the relationship between these parts, these boxes of ideas. And that's where the whole fun is. Anyone who's got a right brain hemisphere that's damaged, they will not be able to function properly. They will not be able to understand relationships. And life is all about relationships. Even a plant knows that. Get a plant, put it far away from the light source in a dark room, you'll see the relationship of the plant to the light. They will reach out for dear life to the light, to the window, because they have a life coming there, from the window. So it's not linear. Usually the term that Lord Buddha would use in describing the links is always paccaya, paccaya, paccaya. Conditioned by. Because of this. But in this case, we have the word Upanisa. And what it means is, in English, roughly, closely tied to, in association with, relying on. Because of the reliance on this, these factors show up. This sutta belongs to a special category, a group of suttas, unique, because it has both what we call, have you ever petted a cat or a dog? When you're just petting or caressing the fur or hair, when you go in a certain way with the hair growth, it's very smooth. That's called anuloma, going in forward motion. And you see that in the paticca samuppada. Avidya paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya, all that. That's moving with anuloma. But then there's the patiloma, which is the backwards, where you're caressing the dog's or cat's hairs or fur in the opposite direction, and then you feel, tick, 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 it's obstructing you. Because it doesn't come natural. In this case, in this sutta, it's unique because it is offering us a way out. It shows us the links of paticca samuppada, dependent arising, but it also has a twist to it, which made me like, whoa, this is unusual. I like this because it has a positive feel to it. You can even call it like it has a but uplifting tone to it, the sutta itself, as you will discover. Because as Lord Buddha is describing all the links, changing one of them, suddenly he presents us a formula that you're not usually seeing in connection to paticca samuppada directly. So I'm giving you guys these heads up, basically, to kind of be prepared when you're hearing. I will stop, I will pause, but so it takes us to the end of the journey, from the starting point, starting from avidya all the way to suffering. But it gives us hope. It gives us hope. which is unusual to find whenever you're studying Paticcasamuppada. It's inferred. The teacher will say, well, the point is, when you're having the feeling, cut the string right there before it turns into craving. Okay, I get that. It's hard, but I'll try. Good luck. But in this case, we're presented with something unusual, and that is saddha. Suddenly, saddha comes into the picture. Faith. I like to call it confidence. Confidence. Because faith, people will think, oh, it's like the same thing as in other religions. And when we're talking about saddha, or faith, in connection to the Dhamma, it's always wise faith, like everything else. Even the chanting has to be wise. Everything has to be attached to the wisdom factor. Otherwise, it's not Dhamma. Plain and simple. So it doesn't have us engaging in head-twisting cognitive games, intellectual games, because Paticcasamuppada is one of the most favorite toys for intellectuals, for scholars. It's a toy. It's a cognitive, intellectual, acrobatic toy, basically. And it doesn't have any end. Doesn't. It just goes on and on and on, and people argue, they have panel discussions, they write books, they have theses, they have dissertations written. Every university that teaches Buddhist subjects, there's at least a few candidates who are presenting a dissertation topic on Paticcasamuppada. But it's not an intellectual endeavor. It's a doing, it's a practice, it's a training, it's a patipada. And this sutta is excellent because it takes you to that. So, without further ado, let us start. It is sutta number, from the Samyutta, this is from the Samyutta Nikaya, from the connected discourses or linked discourses, sutta number 12.23, from the Nidana Vagga Samyutta, or the Samyuttas that are connected with causation, the theme of causation, that's Nidana. And from the Dasabala Vagga, the section on the 10 powers. So Upanisa Sutta, closely tied to, that's how I translated it in this case. At one time, the Blessed One was living in the monastery offered by Anathapindika at Jeta's Grove, in the city of Savatthi. Bhikkhus, I declare that the destruction of the mental contaminants, asavas, is for the one who knows and sees, not for the one who does not know and does not see. But bhikkhus, by knowing and seeing what can the mental contaminants be destroyed? By knowing and seeing what can the asavas be destroyed? By understanding that this is material form, rupa. This is the arising of material form. And this is the fading away of material form. Notes, put it aside, be present for the Dhamma. Give yourself to the Dhamma. Trust. Trust your heart. So, this is the material form, this is the arising of material form, and this is the fading away, cessation of material form. So that takes care of the first aggregate of the Panchakanda. You're seeing it for what it is, you're seeing its arising, and you're seeing its vanishing. But we have four more. These are feelings. This is the arising of feelings, and this is the fading away of feelings. No feeling stays like that. It will always change. That's anicca. Anicca is not a concept that you believe in, that you think about, that you write books on. Anicca is a fact, but only for the person who knows and sees. Sees, knows and sees what? Sees these transitions. as they're taking place in front of your eyes, in your body, on your body, as you're doing Kayanapasana, for example. Watch the breath. There's the form for you, the material form, the breath. Watch it. Watch the chest, watch the belly. See how your body reacts to the breathing. Oh, there is material form. Okay, it's rising and it's vanishing. Feelings, that's a big one. I'm angry. I'm upset. Is that a painful feeling? Good feeling? What is that? Not a pleasant one. You're seeing it now. Okay, did it have a beginning? Oh yes. Were you there to see it? That means, if you were, that means you had a very solid sati. You're on the right track. But stay with it until it vanishes. You're seeing this. Ultimately, we say, Jnana Dassana. What are you seeing and knowing? You've done your practice. You know. That's why it's Patipada. You're seeing this day in, day out. You're not gathering information. You're seeing it. You're in the trenches. That's Dhamma. Dhamma is in your life, not in a Dhamma hall, in a book. It's whenever you're practicing it, to watch it, to see it. These are memories, often translated as perceptions. I don't like perceptions, the term. Memories, or you can even use mental associations. This is sanya. These are memories. This is the arising of memories, and this is the fading away of memories. While you're meditating, sometimes you will have, suddenly, out of the blue, memories show up. Or things that haven't happened, but they're highly influenced by memories. Mental association. Those are sanya. Suddenly, you have a position towards them. You have a relationship. And now you start fighting with them. I was getting into jhana or something, or quiet. Why did this thing invade that space? Well, you have now a relationship with Sanya. You took it seriously. Instead, if you were just watching Sanya, oh, there's Sanya. Watch it carefully, and you will see anicca, because it will die. Because you didn't feed it energy, you didn't give it life, you didn't give it attention. You didn't. You just watched it, you just observe it. These are habitual tendencies, sankharas. I don't like the word formation, it doesn't mean anything for me. Habitual tendencies, which you get from eons and eons of living, having craving, having attachments, having positions towards things, situations. Those compulsions, those proclivities, those drives will still come at you, so long as you're alive. So I'm hoping that you're getting a better understanding of sankharas here. They have everything to do with your life and why you do things the way you do, why you behave in certain ways. Because you're allowing those sankharas to come in and inhabit you like a clothing, get into you. Like the clothing you're wearing, they're lifeless until you give them life. When you dress up in them, get your hands out of the sleeves, and all of a sudden your clothing are moving. So you're becoming like that for the sankharas. The sankharas are inhabiting you, just like you are inhabiting the clothing. You take the sankharas as me, myself, this is who I am. Instead of watching it, watch these sankharas as they arise, as they vanish. But you have to have sati. You cannot watch any of this, because they're happening all the time fast. Because you love stories. Every one of us loves stories. My story, my life story, the way I think as a story. Meanwhile, the water is running from under your feet, life is happening, sankharas are coming in playing with you. You don't even know what's happening. You get angry, you get upset. You don't even ask, why am I upset? I was doing fine. And you don't realize a sanya came in 5 seconds ago, and all of a sudden you just went tightened up. If sati was there, it would have stopped you. Oh, there's a sanya. That's what Lord Buddha is talking about. Know and see. Know and see. That's the only way you will break through the asavas, okay? You can never do enough chanting for that. You can never give dana enough for that. None of these things will take care of it. Only knowing and seeing for yourself will do this. These are habitual tendencies. This is the arising of habitual tendencies, and this is the fading away of habitual tendencies. This is sense awareness. I like that more than consciousness. Sense awareness, because we have the six senses. This is sense awareness. I just felt something, let's say. You hear something. You don't give it personhood. You don't give it a selfhood. You don't turn it into an entity, a self-preserved self on its own, with substance. You don't do that. If you're seeing what it is, you just realize it's a sound. I have ears, they work for now. I heard something, that's a sound, that's the object. And because of these two, the meeting of the two, Lord Buddha says, there's consciousness. That's it. You just saw it. There's no person involved, nothing. It's just happening on its own, organically. So this is sense awareness, this is the arising of sense awareness, and this is the fading away of sense awareness. I have discovered, for myself at least, the way I've experienced this, that sounds are a lot more tangible to understand this principle rather than eyesight, visual. Because you could still be looking at something and you're still thinking that it's still there. Meanwhile, it's happening so fast, it's not there, it's changing, it's dying, it's dying, it's dying. But in the case of a sound, see that? You heard that? That's it. Could you check, could you see when it's happening and when it's gone? Chim, 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 chim. The bird. Or a noise. That's it. That's it. So it becomes a very present-oriented activity. Always. In English grammar, we call it present continuous tense. It's a happening, ing at the end. It's not something that we take it and frame it and accept, yes, this is... No, it's happening. It's happening. Therefore, bhikkhus, the destruction of the mental contaminants comes about for the one who sees and knows this. Yet, this knowledge of the destruction of the mental contaminants comes about through reliance and close association. That's the Upanisa part. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does that knowledge arise in him that the mental contaminants have been destroyed? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on release, vimutti. Because the person has experienced freedom, vimutti, release, they're now able to know and see. That's how we call them a person who has jnana dassana, not someone without having experienced freedom. Release, nibbana. So it's a person who's released themselves from suffering. So you're going to see this happening now, this chain, this in reliance on this, in reliance on this. And you're going to see the other links show up in this. That's why I told you this is an unusual sutta on paticca-samuppada. As you pay attention carefully, you'll see it's a fun sutta, in fact. Makes paticca-samuppada really exciting. For once. I know, it's say that. And by closely associating with what? With and relying on what? Because does that knowledge, okay, so vimutti. But because release itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, because does release take place? Now we're looking at the cause, in a sense, but we don't use the word cause. We're looking at the association of or in reliance on. Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on dispassion, viraga. If you're a passionate person, if you want to go and enjoy life and this and that, and it's really going to be difficult for you to experience release. What are you going to release from? It doesn't sound like you want to release yourself from anything. In fact, you want to submerge yourself in more and more passions. That's why when I was living in Los Angeles and I would give Dhamma talks, I would have some students who very much were in love with life. That was their thing. Have a trouble whenever I talked about viraga. So you want us to be indifferent, you want us to be dead inside and type of thing. I was like, no, you're misunderstanding. But so long as you're in the grip of passions, you're going to suffer because you're putting yourself in harm's way. You're not understanding, you're not willing to understand. You want to be blindfold yourself and rush towards oncoming traffic in rush hour. You're going to get hurt. So the Dhamma is there for those who have eyes to see. It's a wisdom path. But bhikkhus, dispassion itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. So you will see this formula play again and again. I will read them. I'm not going to jump through, because there's an important role that these sentences that I wanted to make sure they're there for you to listen. So if you can even close your eyes. It's, I invite that, in fact. Allow the words to sink in. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does dispassion take place? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on disenchantment, nibbida. But bhikkhus, disenchantment itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does disenchantment take place? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the genuine understanding of how things come to be, yatha bhuta jnana-dassana. But bhikkhus, genuine understanding of how things come to be itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does the genuine understanding of how things come to be take place? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the collected stability of the mind, samadhi. But, bhikkhus, collected stability of the mind itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does the collected stability of the mind take place? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on happiness, sukha. When the body is full of sukha, the mind becomes collected naturally. The mind gets into a state of samadhi naturally. You don't force it. If you force it, samadhi will never take place. It's a natural state of the mind. There needs to be this sense of security and stability. But that's not going to happen without you feeling happy. Sukha, which is the opposite of dukkha. But bhikkhus, happiness itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does happiness come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the tranquility of mind, passaddhi, which is one of the bojjhangas. But bhikkhus, tranquility of mind itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does tranquility of mind come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated. It is by associating with and relying on the spiritual joy, piti. When it is the bojjhanga, or the highest form of joy, that's why we put the other qualifier, spiritual joy, to denote that it is a bojjhanga. It is a special kind of an experience. Call it an emotion. But it's special because there is an echo effect that it has. Because when piti dissolves, the mind, the body, suddenly becomes very tranquil. Because the mind becomes tranquil. Because you are preparing the ground for upekkha eventually. Joy is very fluttering, it's very shaky, it's restless, it's too hot, it's too energized. And that's a good thing for it to dissipate. And once it dissipates, suddenly the mind finds itself in such an unusual level of tranquility. When that happens, it's not a time for you to panic. Don't come rushing to me and saying, I lost my joy, Bhante. That's a good thing. I would want you to pay close attention to the mind, the stillness, the quiet and tranquility that's happening. You're preparing the ground. You're not doing anything because you've already been doing it. It's just taking its own course. It's doing its thing. That's what I mean, get yourself out of the way. Don't try to control. It's happening. Just be a witness to it. Yeah, you can enjoy it. Tranquility. So, that's what it depends on. Tranquility of mind comes because of joy. That's why it's different than any other kind of joy. When you get the lottery, when you get married, or when you find, I don't know, love of your life, or you have a baby or something. Those don't bring right after that sense of tranquility. In fact, they bring you worry. I might lose you. This doesn't happen in this case, because this is the bojjhanga that Lord Buddha is talking about. But bhikkhu, spiritual joy itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does spiritual joy come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated. It is by associating with and relying on delight. Delight, or you can even call it gladness, amojja in Pali. But bhikkhus, delight itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what, bhikkhus, does delight come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the confidence, saddha, faith. Again, this is not blind faith. When you are sitting to meditate, sometimes you will feel there's nothing left. You've tried everything. And you feel hopeless, sometimes. Or you feel the hindrances coming at you from all angles, all of them at the same time, mercilessly. And you don't know what to do. You try to throw something at them, you try to throw 6 R's, you try to throw bojjhangas, you're like, nothing's working. And you panic and you freak out. You forget your inner goodness. You forget your virtues. Think about your sila. Have you broken any sila that day while sitting? That could be that thin thread that can carry you out of the dark, thick forest. Just follow it. This is not blind faith. That is faith in your goodness. That is faith and confidence in the Dhamma. It brought you thus far. Would you go back and live the life that you lived before you came to the Dhamma? Many of us have passed the point of no return. What does that say? In other words, it also is talking about confidence and faith in the Dhamma. So it's always wise wisdom, wise. Another thing that could be said about Saddha is that Saddha only comes out as a result of ordeals you have faced. Challenges, difficulties. If you've never faced any challenges, it's really difficult for you to have real solid, strong faith or confidence. What are you going to have confidence in? Really? Challenges, how you picked yourself up when you hit the ground, when life came at you, when your body failed, when your knees failed, and you somehow had to carry yourself up. Challenges. What did you do with all those? Did you find yourself able to get up when you lost all your money or you lost your loved ones? So, Viktor Frankl comes to mind. And he was a very I respect him, and some of my students respect him. Therapists I've supervised respect him. Because of the kind of life, beautiful life that he has lived, because he's talked about meaning. You see, he was a person who was tossed from his normal life. He was a practitioner, he was a therapist, he was a psychiatrist in Austria. Because of his religion, they tossed him into the concentration camp. And everyone he knew, every close person in his life was killed. Of course you would want to die also, because why would you want to stay and remember them? It's torture. You, in fact, would like to be the first one to go, so you don't end up feeling the pain. So he ended up with that difficult role. Not only that, but he was now giving hope to people in the concentration camp who did not have any hope. And they had all the rights, all the reasons in the world not to have hope. And you're just waiting for them to come and say, okay, you're going to go towards the ovens now. Or we're going to throw you into the gas chamber. You don't know. So you're always in constant fear. To the point where Viktor Frankl would tell jokes to change the mood of people. What is that if not faith? What is that if not saddha? Because it cannot get worse than this, you could say to yourself. It cannot possibly get worse than this. So, ordeals make us, yes, strong, but they can also give us faith. And that faith is essential when you're meditating, especially. Because many people give up. They give up. Every time you feel like you're going to sit for, you had all the determination to sit for 2 hours or 1 hour. And then something happens, and then you get a thought, and you're lost in the tunnel of papanchas, and now you're just like, I'm not going to sit. That's it. I'm going to get up. What happened? Consider that in your ordeal. Come out of that tunnel. Where's your faith? I've sat through worse times. Say that to yourself. Look around. Look at her, how she's sitting. Oh, how come she's sitting so nicely? She's not moving. Look at her. Look at him. Inspire yourself. That's a good thing. That is not mana. We need to compare sometimes to get us up there, because you need to go through your own ignorance, through your own laziness, your ignorance, the complacency, the constant excuses you tell yourself, you make to not sit. So you have to hit rock bottom sometimes to really develop that level of faith. Two individuals come to mind from the Sasana's life, history. Kisa Gotami and Patachara, two venerable Theris, Arahants. They lived a human life, but they lived in hell. For those of you who don't know, and maybe viewers, I'll briefly try to, it's not fair, but I will try because I just was reminded of them. Lady Patachara had fallen in love with someone that her parents had not approved of. She was in love with him, and she had a baby. But she left, basically. They eloped. They went to a different region. She came from a wealthy family, but she left because she married into a lesser class because she loved him. So they go and they live, but they're in poverty. So she wants to go to her parents to have the baby there because that was the custom. And then they argue and they say, well, what if your parents keep you away from me? The man, the husband. So she compromises and then they stay. There's some other minor details, but going back and coming back, begging her, and then they do. And then they have another child. And they're very, very poor. And then, so finally they decide to, okay, fine, for this child, let's go, and let's go together. Let's go together to your mom's, to my in-laws. And they do go. But it's thunderstorm, rain, this and that. So they're out in the woods, they're out in the open, and they're poor. So the husband doesn't have, they don't have stuff to shelter themselves. So the husband goes and looking for some wood, dry wood. But as he's looking for some wood so that he can come back to where they are so that he can start a fire for shelter, a snake, a cobra, attacks him, bites him, and he dies on the spot. Now she's there with her two children, two boys, waiting, and it's getting dark, and she's worried. What are we going to eat? Where's the firewood? She goes looking, so she leaves the boys over there and says, don't move, and the other one is really a toddler, so she goes looking for him, and then she finds him, dead. This is the love of her life. So you can imagine what that does to her. Now she's completely alone with two children to take care of, and plus she has to go all the way the journey back to her family. Now they have to cross a river. She has to cross a river with her boys. She's afraid. So she says, well, you stay here, to the older son. Let me get the infant, the baby, across. So she carries him over her head as she carries this very turbulent river. So somehow she's able to make it to the other side, and she places the baby on the dry shore. And she starts walking back through the river to go get her older son. At that moment, an eagle flies down and picks up her baby to eat. She hears the sound of the eagle swooping down. She turns around and she sees this happening. She obviously starts running towards, and the river is mercilessly coming at her. But it's too late. The baby's gone. It's flying away. There's no way that she's able to get him. And a baby is nothing for an eagle. They can even grab hold of goats, I've seen. They're very strong, powerful. At that moment, she's wailing and, flailing her arms like crazy. Her other son on the other shore thinks that she's calling out for him to come. She's calling, waving at him to come. So he says, okay, I guess mommy wants me to, she trusts me enough to jump into the water. So he jumps into the water trying to swim, and the river just takes him and he dies. She lost her husband and 2 of her boys. She doesn't know what to do. Now what hope does she have? So she somehow, after all that pain, somehow she has to muster up the courage. Eventually, she picks herself up and tries to drag herself in tears, in mourning, to go to the village where her parents lived. As she's going, as she finally reached there, after days, from afar she sees a fire happening in a village, and that's their village. So she gets closer and people are running away. And she says, what's happening? Whose house is that? And they say, it's so-and-so's house. And guess who so-and-so is, or are? Her own parents. And the people are wailing and they're saying they're so sad because they lost their friends. And she says, what do you mean? Both husband and wife had been burned alive. Her own mother and father, to whom she was going. She really loses it. She goes crazy. She runs around, practically naked. And because she's a woman and she's running around naked through the streets of India, people think that she's just, they don't consider all these other contexts, these factors. So they start abusing her, throwing things at her, rocks. They stone her. And if you've lost so much, you can even get beat up, stricken with different things, and you might even start giggling because you want to die so badly, but the reality is so cruel that you just become a cynic. You just mock life. This is it. So it was during that time that somehow someone has the compassion, seeing her, guides her towards Lord Buddha. So she goes, they take her there, and she's naked. So someone puts a robe like that on her, covers her up. And then finally she gets to Lord Buddha, and Lord Buddha sees her and says just a few words. And she stops crying. She realizes dukkha. She knew dukkha. She had been at the bottom of the pit. She knows exactly what's down there in the pitch darkness, better than anybody. But because she did, she becomes an arahant in not so long a time after. Now, suffering can give us that faith, and there's a reason why Lord Buddha is using saddha here. That is the outlet. That is the way out of paticca samuppada. Otherwise, you're going to keep repeating it, repeating it, repeating it. It's not a matter of cut this link, cut that link like we've been taught for ages, and you're free, scot-free from paticca samuppada. It's not like that. It's using your own life experiences to understand and how you can pull yourself out of it by understanding the links and causal relations of them. And Kisa Gotami, just briefly, because it's not fair to leave her out, she had been mocked, abused by her mother-in-law, father-in-law, etc., because she was not having a child. She was not getting pregnant. And finally she does, and not only she does get pregnant, but she gets pregnant and she has a boy. So now she is worshipped. Oh, my daughter. They're not even my daughter-in-law. They're really loving her. So she gets acceptance. She has a son. The status in society goes up. Her husband loves her because she gave him an heir, someone who carries his name, all these things. So she's loving this, and the boy grows up and somehow gets sick and dies. They do everything. She cannot handle that. She carries the boy's body over her shoulder, runs from one doctor to another, until she's lost it. She's not aware of what she's doing, because in her mind she has a goal, and that goal is going to be achieved, which is bringing her son back to life. Because that was her ticket to life. She didn't know life. Suddenly she had a life because of her son. So you could see that was her opportunity for life, for happiness. So she now did not have a life. She wanted her life back. But she also wanted her son back. It's a mother, a human being who has lost her son, her only son. So there's several factors at play. So she also goes insane, you can say, in her behavior, in her attempt, until someone else, she does not get stoned or rocks thrown at her, because they see, despite the fact that she is in such a dismal state, she has a dead boy on her, and no one's able to take that boy so that they can cremate. She's refusing to do that, to cremate. Someone has compassion towards her, and they guide her to Lord Buddha. And she doesn't want to go there first, but then they convince her, because they say, this is a holy man. He's the holiest man in India, in fact. If anyone can bring back your son to life, it's him. Oh, you say that to a mother who lost her only son? She will crawl from here to Timbuktu to get that possibility done. So she goes and carries her son with so much faith and conviction, and she lays her son so gently in front of Lord Buddha and says, please bring him back to me. Lord Buddha looks at her, sees, and Lord Buddha had that ability to see the heart, to see the whole story of the person, what happened, why it happened, etc. All of that within an instant. And he smiles, he says, very well, child. Go and fetch me a handful of mustard seed. She says, that's it? Yeah. So she's about to take off, and he says, oh, wait, get that handful of mustard seed from a home where no death has ever occurred. They don't know of anyone who's died in their family. From that home you could bring. She says, oh, okay. She doesn't even think it through. She says, yeah, okay. So she takes off. She goes from door to door in Savatthi. And they see her state. They say, sure, child, how much do you want? A bag? They say, no. She says, no, just a handful. As they're giving her the seeds, she says, oh, by the way, has anyone died in this family? And they say, yes, my auntie died. My grandmother died. My father died. My son died, etc. So she goes from door to door, and she says, no, I can't then accept. I can't. So as she goes throughout Savatthi, knocking on doors, asking, and then suddenly her ignorance, the veil, is torn down. She sees, oh my, I'm not the only one apparently who loses someone they love. But the impact is far deeper than that, because she is so transformed by this experience. She does not run back to Anathapindika's park to see Lord Buddha. She walks there. She doesn't run, she walks there, and carefully goes towards Lord Buddha, bows down, says, thank you, teacher, takes her child, goes and has the body cremated, then comes back and says, Bhante, please, I would like to go forth. Please ordain me. That's the second example of what suffering can do to a person. It can generate so much faith. Individuals who have gone through trauma, through pain, and it doesn't have to be war or something really majorly, loudly painful. For them it could be, though. It could be minor for many people, but for them it has to be painful. Such a person is a prime candidate to have the journey cut short towards Nibbana. But many of us are actually trying to subdue that, trying to mute that level of difficulty in our lives. We're trying to minimize, we're trying to cover it up, we're trying to ignore. I'm not saying go ahead and celebrate pain, suffering, no. But when you are, don't think it's the end of the world for you. It might be teaching you something. It teaches you at the very least resilience. Resilience is number one. Something that, because of resilience, our species as human beings have survived. It's really, pitiable looking at a human baby. We're the only ones who have to spend so much time being nursed. The baby. You look at a giraffe, you look at a lion, you look at a cow, look at a horse. The baby's born, they have to be getting up on their feet very quickly and know how to eat. You have to really spend a lot of time on a human baby. Somehow we made it through all kinds of difficulties throughout history. How could you do that without resiliency? So we have that. It's not something new that you have to bring into the picture. You have it. We just have to go look for it inside. And when life is giving you lemons, make lemonade, as there's that saying. Look at the possibilities. She used her life, all her pain, all her ordeals, as a way to understand the teachings that Lord Buddha gave. See if you could find yourself in that, in these stories, in these individuals who existed. But bhikkhu's confidence, saddha itself, is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does confidence come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on suffering. Dukkha. There you go. There you go. Confidence comes by relying on dukkha. So dukkha is not just the first noble truth. You have plenty of it in your life. Use it as fuel. Use it as fuel, as a propeller to push you towards Nibbana. Not to try to ameliorate, not to try to cover up, to avoid at all costs, and not learn something from it. But because suffering itself is associated with and relies on another, therefore it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does suffering come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on rebirth or birth, jati. There was a man once who came and he was grieving the loss of his family members. Grieving. And Lord Buddha says, what happened? And he says, I lost my son, my only son, my heir to my throne. What am I going to do? This and that. So he's in pain. And he says, is there a way that we can get rid of pain? We don't experience pain. And Lord Buddha says, yes. But how? He says, how? Lord Buddha asks him, were you born The man says, of course, I mean, I'm talking with you. I'm a human being. I'm sitting here. I was born. He says, if you're born, then you're going to suffer. If you want to cut something, cut that link off from being reborn. And you don't have to deal with any of the music, all the nonsense that we have to deal with for being born. And that doesn't just include birth in the human realm. That also includes even being born in the Brahma realms. So don't go around and hoping, doing donations and things like that I see a lot of people doing, hoping for a rebirth in celestial realms. That is so lame. A person who does that, they should be ashamed of themselves for calling themselves Buddhist. Lord Buddha did not teach us to be reborn in a heaven. That's an insult to the Dhamma. That's why it really, you know, it's upsetting to me when I see that. Upsetting, because I see the wealth of Dhamma and I see it cheapened in the hearts of people. When they bend over backwards to get the money, put it in, you know, envelopes or buy things and this and that, and they go out in style, like on those days, on those festivals, on those big noticeable days. And then you never see them again for some months or a year. And then they show up to do it again. When you ask them, why did you do it? Well, it's a customary, it's in a family, it's in our culture. Fine, but what about the other days? Do those things. I'm not saying don't. Do them because it's a cultural thing, traditional thing. Fine, fine, fine. That's not going to get you to Nibbana. That's not going to get you out of samsara. Forget it. It will never, ever get you wisdom. Being reborn in a heavenly realm, okay? Never. Some of the devas have more sexual lust than you. Do you know that? More than you can possibly have. Some of them are very sneaky. They like to lie. They like to sleep around with their friends' wives or husbands. Yes, some of the devas do. That doesn't mean that all the devas are like that, of course. But they're not so different than human beings, so long as they don't know, they don't have the Dhamma in their hearts. Because there's a lot of devas who have sila, samadhi, panya, they live by. They practice the 8 precepts. Can you imagine that? Devas. And you can tell them apart from the others. You can. But they're also waiting for that time for them to become arahants. Because they're so disenchanted. Remember the dispassion, disenchantment? Nibbida, viraga. They have it in their hearts. That's why they always seclude themselves in the heavenly realms. Or they come back down to earth, they go somewhere secluded. Leave me alone. So that they can practice. Remember yesterday's bhikkhu who died while he was standing? And lands in Tabatinsa heaven? He's like, oh. What happened? That's pain for that person. Because, yeah, he has the thing which billions of people, human beings, want, desire. He doesn't want it. Lord Buddha, as Siddhartha, had so much of the things that human beings to this day drool over. Drool over. I remember when I would talk about Lord Buddha's, biography to people who are not Buddhist, like some young men that I, students and things, they would like, really? 500 women? Wow. I'm like, Yassa, who was one of the earliest students, Yassa, he was the son of a very, very wealthy person. You could call him a Maharaja to that level. So he also had 3 palaces, because India has 3 major seasons. So that was a custom. If you were rich, you would get a palace. 3, actually, for each of the seasons. So he did not have any male males basically in, and guards, this and that. They were all female in his palaces. Go ahead and have fun, basically. And musicians, this and that. One day, after one of those very crazy parties, everybody's sleeping, drunk, this and that. He starts looking at those very beautiful, attractive women that were handpicked by his parents. He's looking at them and he's like, what happened to her? What happened to her? They're drooling, they're snoring, they're just being human, they're sleeping. It's like, they're not trying to be attractive, seductive. He gets disgusted. He sees the reality of things because he was living in delusion. He's like, is this it? And he gets those slippers, gold, weaved, whatever type of very expensive slippers, and he finds his way out of the palace. And he rushes out in the early morning hours. He doesn't know where he's going. He's like, I don't want to stay here. I'm done. And he's not married, so he's a bachelor. And he goes walking, and then somehow, I'm sure Lord Buddha had something to do with that, the positioning, he sees Lord Buddha sitting in the middle of the forest, in his path. And he goes and he listens, and he becomes a Sotapanna. Very quickly. Now his father, he knows his son's slippers, and what type of a footprint they leave behind. He comes, he looks for his son, he can't find, he's panicking. Somebody must have kidnapped my son, because he's so rich, and he's his only son. So he rushes outside with his men, and he's just like running around like crazy. And he finds suddenly there his son's footprints disappear. But there's a yogi sitting there. Lord Buddha was already a Buddha. Lord Buddha says, he uses his psychic abilities and he makes the son disappear. He's there. He becomes invisible to the father. So the father is, in the days, he's like, Samana, have you seen my son? I lost my son. I'm afraid they kidnapped him. They might have killed him. Please help me. Lord Buddha says, I have seen your son. Settle down. You say that to a father who lost his son, suddenly you just gave him a gift of life again. And he sits down and says, okay, I can see my son. He's like, yes, you will see your son very soon. He's here. Okay. So Lord Buddha starts teaching him the Dhamma. Soon enough, the father becomes a Sotapanna. Now, because he's a Sotapanna, he has special Saddha. His 3 fetters have dropped. And now, because his son was also listening to the Dhamma talk, well, he becomes, first of all, he turns invisible again. So the father says, oh, my son. And the son now says, Bhante, I want to go forth. I want to become a monk. Now the father looks at him and he says, he cannot be his old self anymore because he's seen the Dhamma. He has jnana dassana. You have such a strong, powerful faith that nothing is even closely equal to the Dhamma. So if his son's saying, I want to become a bhikkhu, his father will say, where do I sign? Of course you can. So the son becomes a bhikkhu, and the mother also, later on they go, and the father actually, that was the first laity, that we have, who have invited. Actually, there's also the dana ceremony they did. So they invited the Sangha. It was very small Sangha at the time. So they go and Lord Buddha gives a Dhamma talk to the mother and the sisters and all the ladies in the house. Guess what? They end up Sotapanna as well. This is in the earliest days of the Sasana. So I sidetracked, deviated. But it's still within the circle of Dhamma. So, but because rebirth itself is associated with and relies on another, therefore it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with what? By the way, if you noticed, suffering substituted. Here we're seeing the links of Paticca Samuppada that you're familiar with. But instead of using jati marana, old age and death, Lord Buddha substituted with, what does jati marana give you? Suffering. Dukkha. He substituted it with suffering. Which you don't see this arrangement. That's why this sutta is so unique. So, and by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does rebirth come about? Here bhikkhus, excuse me, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the becoming, or on becoming, bhava, becoming. So now you see how it's going, the links. But because becoming itself is associated with and relies on another, therefore it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does becoming come about? Here bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on grabbing, which oftentimes they translate as grasping or clinging. Clinging to me sounds very weak. I'm clinging. No. Upadana is grabbing. You grab and you don't want to let go. That's upadana. That's why you're stuck on this for eons throughout samsara. You're not clinging. I cling. No. Grab. Grab. So we have to eliminate birth. But how can you eliminate that? It's by getting rid of grabbing. Even tanha. If you have enough sati, you can stop it. After tanha has been spotted, you can. Even though many scholars have said, no, even meditation teachers I've had in the past, you have to cut the link right after feeling becomes tanha. Well, that's happening very fast. But tanha, you can still smell it because it has to germinate, it has to gestate, it has to fester in you. You can sense tanha a lot more. It's very saturated compared to feeling. It stands out. But it's not as gross, as thick, as loud, as grabbing as upadana. So if you could still get rid of tanha at that point without turning it into grabbing, into upadana, you still have a chance of not getting reborn from moment to moment. And by the way, another thing that many interpreters, thanks to Visuddhimagga and Venerable Buddha Ghosha's mistakes in interpreting Paticca Samuppada, to this day I know scholars and monks who look at the Paticca Samuppada and see 3 different lifetimes. That's wrong, completely. Because Lord Buddha was very much of a realist. He cared about what's happening to you now. Now. So this is happening now. So don't think of it in relation to different lifetimes or the next birth necessarily. Think of it even in terms of what will happen next. Your relationship, the next type of becoming that you get involved in. Your next attachment is a birth, you know. Oh, just this thing, I'll do this, I'll get drunk, or I'll go out and I'll have fun, I'll lose myself, just this time. Just one more glass, one more. I'm giving you a grosser image. It could be something even subtle, but it's the same thing. What you relinquish, despite what you know. That's ignorance. That's why there's birth. That's why there's suffering. That's why there is old age, sickness, and death. All of it happening in close proximity in this life. Not even half an hour later, by the way. And you can also, I mean, the whole point about sati, excuse me, upadana, to cut it, You need to have sati and sampajanya. Mindfulness and full alertness has to be there. Otherwise, you don't even know that you are grabbing. You might call that, oh, I'm just like that. I'm passionate. Or something. I get angry, okay? That's my nature, okay? Really? There are triggers. There's instances. You're not even seeing the cycle that is getting you to that angry state. Paticcasamuppada is taking place. You're not even aware of it. Before you got that angry, you were holding on to something. Something happened. You saw something, you heard something, etc. But because grabbing itself is associated with and relies on another, therefore it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does grabbing come about? Here bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on craving, tanha. You know that. But bhikkhus craving itself is associated with and relies on another, therefore it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does craving come about? Here bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on feeling, vedana. You're seeing paticcasamuppada now, right? But bhikkhus, feeling itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does feeling come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on contact, phassa. It all can be narrowed down to that. It's all there, contact. If you can spot it at contact, you're set. It doesn't even end up as feeling. You stopped it at the source. But where does contact happen? We'll find out. I thought you'd never ask. But bhikkhus, contact itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does contact come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the 6 sense spheres, salayatana. Contact is taking place at each of these 6 sense doors. The eyes, the nose, the ears, the body, the tongue, and the big one, the mind. Why do we practice satipatthana? To get closer to the door, each of these doors, to catch it before it turns into something. Something that we attribute a self to. Me, asmimana, like yesterday we were reading. Asmimana, the conceit I am. If you have sati, you are at the top of the game, as they say. You're alert. You're not being fooled anymore. Those are your gates. You maintain control of those gates, and sati is the gatekeeper with sampajanya, because it is alert, fully alert. And that will open the door for panya, because you're going to see pattern. Because I close my eyes, I turn my attention away from this door, and suddenly invaders come in. And they're always coming in. Always. But because the 6 sense spheres themselves are associated with and rely on another, therefore they do not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what because do the 6 sense spheres come about? Here, because it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on mentality and materiality. Nama-rupa. Nama-rupa, sometimes called name and form. I don't like that term. It's too simplistic. And the other day I mentioned what is nama and what is rupa. Rupa is made up of the 4 primary elements, and these are not actual chemical molecular aspects of the element of solidity, for example. We don't look at them as such. Quality of solidity, earth element. That's what we mean. Same thing with fire, which is the heat element. The same thing with water, the fluidity element. And the air, the spatial, space, relating with space element, openings. And nama is Vedana Sanya, intention, Cetana, then Manasikara, and then finally contact. That grouping. A very good sutta to explore that is Sammaditthi Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. Wonderful, wonderful sutta. But bhikkhus, mentality, materiality themselves are associated with and rely on another. Therefore, they do not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus do mentality, materiality come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on sense awareness, vijnana. But bhikkhus, sense awareness itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus does sense awareness come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on the habitual tendencies, sankhara. Sankharas. Those are the biggies. Those are the old echoes. Think of them as ripples. Ripples. You keep throwing pebbles in the middle of the lake, quiet lake. Well, if you just have to wait, and the ripples will reach you, standing at the shore, however far it is. You've done things, tendencies you have, momentum you've created by actions, by choices, by intentions, by attention. Sadly, ayoniso manasikara or amanasikara, non-attention, or even worse, wrong attention. And that's what basically means when you are breaking sila, whether it's by body, speech, or mind. The effects of those, because you've created it. I've given the example of taking one of those toy cars, metal cars that has a spring, so you just have to wind it up. You just go, and then you let go, and just it flies. And that's sankhara. You've been doing that for eons. And now all of a sudden you're sitting there not minding your own business, nothing, all of a sudden these tendencies show up. Well, and then we blame Maha, we blame this, we blame that, the body, all these things. Well, they didn't come out of the blue. They came because you wound them up. The momentum was created by us, no one else. But because the habitual tendencies themselves are associated with and rely on another. Therefore, they do not come about without reliance and close association. And by closely associating with and relying on what bhikkhus do habitual tendencies come about? Here, bhikkhus, it should be stated, it is by associating with and relying on ignorance, avidya. But bhikkhus, ignorance itself is associated with and relies on another. Therefore, it does not come about without reliance and close association. This is where the repetition stops. And now Lord Buddha goes into paraphrasing all of this. Thus, bhikkhus, ignorance is closely tied to the habitual tendencies. So now he is showing you the other way around. The other way. Anuloma patiloma that I was saying. The habitual tendencies are closely tied to sense awareness. Sense awareness is closely tied to mentality, materiality, namarupa. Sense awareness is consciousness that oftentimes is translated by the vijnana. Mentality, materiality is closely tied to the 6 sense spheres. The 6 sense spheres are closely tied to contact. Contact is closely tied to feelings. Feelings are closely tied to craving. Craving is closely tied to grabbing. Grabbing is closely tied to becoming. Becoming is closely tied to rebirth. Rebirth is closely tied to suffering. And here is where we get that upward spiral that I was talking about. the hope factor. Suffering is closely tied to confidence or faith, saddha. That is why this sutta is special, because it gives us that extra, that boost. It's showing us a way out. Literally, it's showing us a way out. It doesn't keep us in the circle. Meanwhile, confidence is closely tied to delight. Delight is closely tied to joy. Joy is closely tied to tranquility of mind, passaddhi. Tranquility of mind is closely tied to happiness. Happiness is closely tied to the collected stability of mind, samadhi. The collected stability of mind is closely tied to the genuine understanding of how things come to be. Yatha bhutang pajanati. The genuine understanding of how things come to be is closely tied to disenchantment. Disenchantment is closely tied to dispassion. Dispassion is closely tied to release, vimukti. You need to have the experience of disenchantment. You need to have the experience of viraga, dispassion, if you want to experience vimukti. So the joys that you would get from normal experiences of the six senses will have to diminish. Don't worry, you don't have to do anything about that. Keep practicing, keep doing sati, because you will see that the things that used to get you excited, suddenly they don't. People think, oh, you're becoming indifferent. No, you're not. You're just developing more and more dispassion. It's fading. Another word for dispassion is fading away. So you're not really rattled up as much as you would have in the same circumstance. People look at you and they say, you're different. You don't get excited as you used to. What happened to you? Are you taking anything? And some people might even worry about you. But then they see you smiling and laughing and joyful, and there's so much metta in your heart, they don't know how to figure it out. And then they see that you're giving them so much love, so much compassion, and you're calm and you're kind and you're like, you're okay. They're really scratching their heads now. You're not depressed, obviously. You might not have the previous things that used to really animate you. You needed them, but you don't. But still, you're happy. And now secretly, they desire what you have. That's why I encourage students to go ahead and be generous. Go ahead and be generous, starting with the smile. One of the fun things which I do, some of my students don't like this, is especially if you come from a closed, traditional, cultural background, let's say, closed in the sense that you're not so physically affectionate, or verbally. Go and tell your mother, I love you. How about your dad? How about your sister? Go ahead and hug them. That is like, when I said once to one of my students, they go, oh no, no, Bhante, don't ask me to do that. No. A lot is happening. But once they do, you really shake the world of this other person. They don't know the Dhamma. They might not appreciate the Dhamma if you give them, like, this is Dhamma, these are the Four Noble Truths. They might never do that, but you have touched something so deep in them. That's what I mean by sharing. You don't, of course, many of us don't have those abilities, or situations or conditions, but you can just smile. I have to convince people to smile. Really. Some people have fought, like argued with me. Why do you want me to smile? I'm not comfortable with that. No. They think there's something wrong with me. Let them. Who cares? But feel the joy and then share it. You don't like to share it with your close friends? Go ahead and share it with absolute strangers. Go to the park. Go somewhere. Share it with some people you don't know. They don't have an old agenda with you. But give them away. And suddenly something marvelous will happen. They will smile back, or they'll look at you funny, but then they will smile. And you don't even have to get a response from that. Many places I would be, there suddenly people would come, I'm not even looking at them, I'm just smiling, working on my dissertation, let's say, at a coffee shop I used to go to a lot, working for years. And then people would start coming and talking. I'd never talked to them, I never said hello. Minding my own business in the far corner of the room. People would start to say, hey, what are you working on? As if we've known each other for ages. I'm just respectful. People of all ages. Old ladies, old men would come and start conversations with you. It's lovely. You feel connected. You really feel humanity. And you were responsible for that. Isn't that great? To me, that sounds very much like sanditiko, immediately effective, directly visible. Who knew? Well, you do now. Monks, or bhikkhus, just as the raindrops that fall on top of the mountain and course down. I need you to visualize this. If you can close your eyes, I'll read it slow. Bhikkhus, just as the raindrops that fall on top of the mountain and course down to the lowlands, filling up the mountain grottos, crevices, and small creeks, then that water flows further down and fills up small pools. The pools then turn into larger lakes, and those lakes pour into flowing streams, which then turn into small rivers that pour into larger rivers themselves, until finally the overflowing rivers pour into the ocean and out into the great oceans. In just the same manner, because ignorance is closely tied to the habitual tendencies. Habitual tendencies are closely tied to sense awareness. Sense awareness is closely tied to mentality materiality. Mentality materiality is closely tied to the 6 sense spheres. The 6 sense spheres are closely tied to contact. Contact is closely tied to feelings. Feelings are closely tied to craving. Craving is closely tied to grabbing. Grabbing is closely tied to becoming. Becoming is closely tied to rebirth. Rebirth is closely tied to suffering. Suffering is closely tied to confidence, faith. Meanwhile, confidence is closely tied to delight. Delight is closely tied to joy. Joy is closely tied to tranquility of mind. Tranquility of mind is closely tied to happiness. Happiness is closely tied to the collected stability of mind. The collected stability of mind, samadhi, is closely tied to the genuine understanding of how things come to be. The genuine understanding of how things come to be is closely tied to disenchantment. Disenchantment is closely tied to dispassion. Dispassion is closely tied to release, and release is closely tied to the knowledge of the destruction of mental contaminants. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Years ago, I would have the image. I used to think about possibilities, situations, and play these scenarios or puzzles in my head as a child. And one of them was this. Imagine a circular room. The space, well, it's a four-walled room, but you're going in a circle inside of it. There's a door, an open door, doorway. Let's say someone gives you infinite lifespan. You will not die. and you will never need food, and you will never go to the bathroom, and you will never grow old. And you have energy, limitless energy, to walk. But you're walking with these variables, with these criteria, in a circle. If you keep walking in a circle, you will never, ever leave the room. Ever. That's us. That's us. Samsara is that. In fact, Paticca is that. That's how I see it. It's circular. Until you start taking straighter steps strategically away from the circle and towards the doorway. And it might be just a few steps. You've spent an infinity there, meanwhile. This sutta teaches you a way to get out of that room. The room being samsara. Now, can you use your suffering as an impetus, as a drive, as a springboard, jumping board into gaining confidence and faith? Already, if you do, you've taken a step towards the door. One step. And then what happens? You take another step. Pamoja. Right? You have that delight because you have faith. You're not taking blind faith steps. You're seeing, okay, if I don't do this, when a person is keeping sila, you have to have some references to, has you keeping the sila thing kept you away from feeling regrets, remorse, pain, suffering? If you're doing it right, guess what? Sila has protected you. What is that? That gives you delight. Wow, you mean to say I don't have to get arrested again? Let's say if the person used to do things, break into things and harm people. Yeah. You're not going to get beat up. You're not going to put yourself in harm's way. You're not going to harm anyone. People are going to start liking you more. People will feel safe around you. Animals will feel safe around you because they'll know this guy is harmless. They will feel your energy, no? Animals are very sensitive. If you have bad intentions, they will know. They will know. They will stay 7 miles away from you, some of them. And then because of pamujja, you have piti. Joy arises. You get rich. You feel rich. You don't have to harm anyone. You don't have to steal anything. I'm just using the example of sila, of course. Could be others. Now, because you have joy, remember what I said earlier about the bojjhangas? If you have spiritual joy, what's the aftermath of that? What's the echo? Passaddhi, yes, tranquility of mind. Now you're really getting ready for samadhi. And this is all happening thanks to you. You owe it to yourself to say, wow, this is happening. That's why some people come and say, Bhante, I don't want to be enjoying this. And I say, why? But I was told not to. Why? Go ahead and enjoy suffering? No. It's okay. Feel the tranquility of mind. Feel the dimensions of that. Because of that, you're going to suddenly drop into samadhi. And then because of that, you're going to enjoy, you see things, because your mind is so much in upekkha, you start seeing yatha bhutang pajanati. You start seeing how things happen. You start looking at feelings and you're like, that's a feeling. And oh yeah, that's how it started. Oh, there it is. Oh, it disappeared. Oh, gone. Oh, there's another one. Oh, there it is. Oh, that's a hateful one. Oh, I don't like that. Oh, who doesn't like that? I do. Oh, interesting. And poof, that's gone. You get to be faster, and you're not like really trying harder. It just happens on its own because you are maintaining sati. That's what makes it fun. It's not a chore, like climbing up a steep hill, slippery. Somebody's dumping a bucket of oil. It's not like that. It's not. And that's what's going to bring in nibbida, which is disenchantment. Because you're seeing the process and you're seeing your involvement. And because of nibbida, now you have viraga. And because of viraga, now you have vimutti. And because you have vimutti, you have jnana dassana. That's one way of looking at paticca samuppada. So, remember, saddha is not, I mentioned again and again that it has to be wise. But what do we mean by wise? It needs to have yoniso manasikara, otherwise it's meaningless. You have to have wise, reflective attention. But that without kusala kamma is also meaningless. They work hand in hand to lift up saddha. They bring it out of the ground. They bring it out of the ground. You need both. You need to have actions that are wholesome. And that includes, remember, from the earliest talks I've given here, months ago, your thoughts are actions, don't forget. Your speech is action. And then your bodily actions, which are all caught up in embodied within the 5 panchasila you take. Now you're taking the 8th. It's even more obvious. So you're practicing, even when you're practicing sila, you're practicing. And if your sati is there, you're also practicing yoniso manasikara. And guess what? That inevitably brings up the faith, the confidence level in you. And you're never the same person again. So don't think that sotapatti is going to happen just like that without you doing anything. That's why it's absolutely a must for the person to be practicing sila, samadhi, panya. That's why I laugh at people who say, oh, I do, silent retreats, I do vipassana or this and that, in the absence of sila. Some people do it, and they do it right. But many of the wholesale activities that are going on in the world, there's no sila. I just shake my head and it's like, sorry, it's not going to get you far except for giving you migraine, resentment, hatred, anger. But I hope this sutta was inspiring enough for you. So maybe now I can. No? Oh, today I was with one of the interviewees. I recalled a story which I've mentioned before in some talks before, and it has to do with the cockroach and the centipede. Some of you remember probably. Oh, this is about overthinking, using a lot of reliance on intellect, thoughts, principles, ideas, data, basically. That's Dhamma. That's the Dhamma. Yes, and that's all that junk. So one day, a cockroach is sitting on the edge of a porch, not a Porsche, but a porch, and enjoying Sunday afternoon. He just had a meal, thrown hamburger somewhere, maybe eating, and just like, he's lounging, he's just lazy, he's just enjoying it. And looking over his shoulder, he sees a centipede walking. He double takes and he's like, what? And he calls him and he says, my friend, stop. And the centipede stops and he looks and he says, what? The cockroach says, how do you do it? How do you do it? And the centipede says, what? What are you asking me? He says, the cockroach says, I have 6 legs, 6, and I have a difficulty walking. You have 100. How do you know which foot to put in front of the other? How do you know to put foot number 57 in front of foot number 58. How do you know? And the centipede starts scratching his head and he says, I never thought of that. In fact, now that you say it, I'm kind of confused. And they say that that centipede never was able to walk again. Now, being inundated with thoughts, ideas, doctrines, principles that you've memorized, you've written down, taken notes of, memorized, maybe put them on your walls. Usually when people write it, usually they never look at it again. Or they chew on it for many, many days, years in some cases. It becomes like that. And that poor centipede is unable to walk. The Dhamma is about the walking. Remember, Lord Buddha used these terms in a very wise way. Magga is a path, is a way, a path. Magga. You don't stand there in the Magga and just look. Oh yes, or take, do drawings like, forced perspective and just like 1 point perspective. You don't do that. You walk the path. Unfortunately, just like that image I gave you of one professor who shared that image, the story of getting a prescription from a doctor for his sickness and then laminating it, making it larger and larger and larger, and then carrying it over his head and saying, I have the cure to my cancer, to my sickness. How? You have a copy of the prescription, which is not even the medicine. And even if you hold the medicine in your hand, you're not taking it. How is this the cure? And that's my cautionary note. Don't do that. And be like the centipede who just walks. It's like, yeah, let me walk. I'll know for sure how the ground feels without overthinking. Because many of us, when we overthink, we stop living. We stop living. Lord Buddha says, you need to know this much Dhamma. Just this much. Just this much. So let's not hoard a lot of teachings and thinking that that's it. No, it's just a menu of a food which you need to eat because you're starving. Menu, piece of paper. Now actually they're also doing QR code. It's not even it's like, yeah, take a picture and go ahead. What if you don't have service? Good luck. You'll eat, sure. Whoa, it's 3 pages. 3 pages. Do I have to read this? So I just jump in. So I'm reading it as you're listening to it. Okay? And I'll try to be fast enough to catch anything if it's kind of too revealing or something of them. Dear Bhante Candana, I wish you well and happy always. I have been coping with a lot of body pain the last 2 days. So I radiated metta to all of my body and actually talk to each painted body part, thighs, shoulder pain, and painful body part, shoulder pain, etc. And the pain either goes away or becomes much more tolerable, okay? Even the numbness reduced considerably, though it does not completely disappear. However, I did change a technique on the spiritual friend. Instead of placing the friend in my heart, I radiated metta to her externally. She is one of the... Okay, I can't say that. It is, keeping it anonymous, it is much more comfortable for me this way, as the metta gets to radiate out rather than going back into my heart. It goes out. Because of the proximity, yes, that helps, but this is a luxury that the person has. Because in real life, usually the person that we radiate metta to are not that close to us physically. So they're usually in another city, in another part of the country or the world. So that will elevate, intensify the metta radiating because they're always there in front of you, especially if they're in the same room. Hint, hint. So, rather than going back into my heart, it goes out. Okay. Next, the many disruptive thoughts and stories in my mind started to reduce, and I could sit longer now with less thoughts arising. Then a sense of calm and happiness swept through me. Are you sure you didn't want me to actually? Why didn't you tell me this in an interview? This is like a very personal thing, so anyhow, this is what I say, like you need to narrow it down, get to the crux of the matter. This is not just for this person. Don't tell me stories, please. We don't have that much time. Overall, did I do it right? See, this is a personal question, one-on-one interview time. Did I apply all of the meditation thing? Well, no, you didn't apply it correctly. You were, let's say, spontaneous, but you changed. That's why we have the one-on-one interviews, so that I can guide you. Ask me first. Don't just try to do things. I see that a lot. Everybody's becoming like self-employed type of a thing. Yeah, I'm going to do my thing. Why are you here then? Why are you even like wanting to listen to me as a teacher? How would that benefit? You want confirmation? Yeah, you did right. Okay, good, go. No, that's not going to help. Whatever I told you, do that. There's that stubbornness that I see. It's not just one person, by the way. Yeah. And then they go and come back when I ask them, okay, what happened? What did you do? And they tell me a total different thing. Like, why did I waste my time? Why am I wasting my time? I just said to you, and when I did the interviews, are you willing to do exactly what I tell you to do? And you said, yes. What is this? Do exactly what you're told during this time. Don't change anything. Then, which you agreed on. If you want to make a certain recipe, and I give you the recipe, every single ingredient, and then you go ahead and you say, yeah, I don't like that. I don't like that. Yeah, those I'll keep. Okay, let's cook. Let's bake. And you bake it and something else comes out. And then you come and say, how come is this different? You put different ingredients in there. It doesn't take a wizard to find that out. So stop being so stubborn, like a piece of wood, dry wood in your head. If you trust that much yourself, why are you here? Just go ahead and continue doing what you've been doing all your life and be miserable. You're here because you want to try something during these 10 days. Then, as I told you many, many times, go ahead and do whatever you want outside the retreat, not while you're in it. Don't add anything, don't take out anything, just do it. Okay? And you should get the results, but you're impatient also. You're welcome for the constant encouragement. Yes, metta back to you. O writer of these notes. So I'll stop here. Wow, that's a lot of time, 2.5 hours. Please spend the time either walking or sitting, pondering, allowing the Dhamma that you heard to seep into you, but without adding pressure, without adding tension or demands on yourself. Can you be like a sponge, a dry sponge that's laid in a bucket of water, and soak as much as possible? You're not going to get everything, that's fine. But even a little bit is so much. It's life-changing. So may your practice bring you much good results. Sukhi Hod. Let's do the transfer of merits. Akasata chabumata devana gamahiddhika Punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu loka sasanam. Akasatha chabumata devanagamahitika. Punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu desanam. Akasatha chabumata devanagamahitika. Punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu mam paranti. Sadhu, sadhu.